Marlene Hatcher stood on the stage of the Summer Jubilee, her breath hitching as her husband Lloyd wrapped a heavy, paternalistic arm around her shoulders. To the crowd of wealthy donors, he looked like a devoted spouse comforting a fragile wife. But Marlene felt his thumb dig savagely into her bruised ribs, pinning her in place. "My wife is having a mental breakdown," Lloyd whispered into the microphone, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "She's been stealing the residents' medication." As the board president stepped forward with a pair of handcuffs and the local police closed in, Marlene looked down at her hands, stained with rain-slicked mud and the blood of the man currently smiling at her audience. The emergency insulin shipment was supposed to save Mr. Abernathy's life. But when Marlene finally pried open the crate, she didn't find medicine. She found stacks of old newspapers and heavy red bricks. Somewhere in the dark, rain-drenched hallways of Magnolia Gardens, a silent accomplice had duct-taped the security cameras and replaced life-saving vials with trash. Marlene was trapped between a violent predator and a community that now branded her a thief. And as the storm rattled the tent poles, she realized the most dangerous person in the room wasn't the man holding the knife, but the one holding the microphone. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their sickly glow bouncing off the linoleum floors, still sticky from last night's mop job. Marlene Hatcher's sneakers squeaked with each hurried step, the sound swallowed by the hum of the air conditioner and the distant clatter of a dinner tray hitting the floor. She clenched her teeth, fingers digging into the clipboard until the edges bit into her palms. The air in the Magnolia Gardens nursing home felt thick, saturated with the scent of bleach and the underlying sour tang of unwashed bodies and antiseptic. She yanked open the supply closet door in the east wing, the hinges groaning in protest. Her eyes scanned the shelves, skipping over the stacks of adult diapers and half-empty bottles of hand sanitizer. She was looking for the blue and white refrigerated cooler, the emergency shipment of life-critical insulin. It wasn't there. Her breath came sharp and shallow. Without that insulin, 3 of her residents wouldn't make it through the night. The gravity of the situation settled in her gut like cold lead. A potential medical catastrophe was unfolding in the quiet, mint-green hallways she had spent 20 years protecting. She pushed back out into the corridor, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The nursing home was transforming around her, a garish masquerade of celebration that felt like an insult to the crisis. Volunteers in bright yellow t-shirts were stringing pink and gold streamers across the handrails, their laughter echoing off the scuffed walls. Marlene checked her watch. 3 p.m. The Summer Jubilee fundraiser was set to begin in exactly 2 hours, and the facility would be flooded with wealthy donors, board members, and local press. The mounting pressure made her vision blur for a second. She had 120 minutes to locate the missing vials before the first doses were due, and the residents began to slip into the irreversible fog of ketoacidosis. Every happy jubilee, she heard from a passing volunteer, felt like a needle prick to her frayed nerves. She moved with a desperate, focused energy, checking the medication carts, the break room fridge, even the laundry bins, her mind racing through a checklist of logistics that refused to yield an answer. "Marlene, thank God," a voice called out, sharp and weary. Marlene turned to see Sarah Thompson, the head nurse, hurrying toward her. Sarah's cat-eye glasses were sliding down her nose, and her face, usually a mask of professional composure, was pinched with worry. They met near the central nurses' station, a small island of chaos in the middle of the decorating frenzy. Sarah didn't waste time with pleasantries. She leaned in close, her voice a low, urgent murmur. "The emergency shipment from the dock? It's gone, Marlene. The manifest says it was offloaded at noon, but the loading dock is empty. Just a few pallets of linens and a stray cat. Marlene felt the world tilt. The realization that the medication hadn't just been delayed, but had actually reached the property and then vanished, turned her blood to ice. Both women stood in the center of the humming hallway, a shared, silent acknowledgement passing between them. This wasn't an administrative error. It was a theft or a catastrophic lapse in security that they couldn't afford to explain to the board. As Marlene turned to head toward the loading dock herself, a sudden searing lance of pain shot through her side. She gasped, her hand flying to her midsection, her fingers brushing the stiff fabric of her scrubs. Beneath the cotton, a fresh, plum-colored bruise bloomed across her ribs. A parting gift from Lloyd this morning when she'd tried to suggest he look for work instead of the bottle. She adjusted her posture, forcing her spine to straighten despite the agony that made every breath a chore. She couldn't let Sarah see. She couldn't let anyone see the cracks in her armor. To the staff at Magnolia Gardens, Marlene Hatcher was the unbreakable anchor, the woman who handled every crisis with a steady hand. If they knew she was flinching at her own shadow, the whole fragile ecosystem of the home would collapse. She swallowed the metallic taste of fear, masking her physical trauma with a practiced, stoic expression. Though her pulse throbbed in the scar above her eyebrow, a permanent reminder of a previous conversation with her husband. "The driver," Sarah continued, sensing Marlene's distraction but misinterpreting it as mere stress. She gripped Marlene's arm, her fingers tight. "I caught him before he pulled out of the driveway. He was pissed, said he didn't have time for a cross-examination. But I pushed him. He said he didn't leave the cooler on the platform. He said a man met him at the truck, a man who signed the electronic pad and took the box directly." Sarah paused, her eyes searching Marlene's. "He described him. Big guy, flannel shirt, greasy hair. Said he had a way of looking at you that made you want to check your pockets." "Marlene? It sounds exactly like Lloyd." A wave of sickening dread washed over Marlene, more potent than the pain in her ribs. It wasn't just a random theft. Lloyd was here. He was inside her sanctuary, reaching out with his thick, scarred hands to dismantle the only part of her life that still made sense. He was sabotaging her, using the residents' lives as pawns in whatever twisted game of control he was playing today. The dread didn't paralyze her. It transmuted into a cold, hard anger. Marlene took a deep breath, ignoring the protest from her lungs. "I'll handle it, Sarah. Keep the volunteers in the dining hall. Don't let them near the East Wing." She was moving before she finished the sentence, her mind already pivoting to damage control. She retreated to her small, windowless office and grabbed the desk phone. Her fingers flew across the keypad, calling every local clinic and pharmacy within a 20-mile radius. She spoke in her nurse voice, clipped, professional, and utterly unyielding. She bargained, she pleaded, and eventually, she negotiated. A small clinic in West Biloxi had a surplus of rapid-acting insulin they could spare, but they couldn't deliver. She would have to go. She focused entirely on this logistical hurdle, pushing the image of Lloyd's mocking grin out of her head. She had to secure an alternative source. The safety of Mr. Abernathy and the others was the only thing that mattered now. She grabbed her keys and bolted for the side exit, her sneakers hitting the pavement of the parking lot with a rhythmic slap. The Mississippi humidity hit her like a wet wool blanket, the air thick with the scent of salt and hot asphalt. She was 20 feet from her beat-up sedan when a figure stepped out from behind a delivery van. It was Lloyd. He looked exactly as Sarah had described, heavy, sallow-skinned, wearing a flannel shirt that was far too warm for the afternoon heat. He was smiling, but it was the grin of a man who had just found a secret way to hurt someone. He stepped into her path, his broad shoulders blocking her access to the driver's side door. The parking lot was a vast, sun-baked expanse of cracked asphalt, and in this moment, it felt like a desert where no one could hear her scream. "Where's the fire, Marley?" Lloyd's voice was a low, dangerous rumble, the sound of a storm moving in over the gulf. He didn't wait for an answer. He moved with a sudden, practiced fluidity, grabbing her upper arm and spinning her around. He slammed her back against the hot metal of the car, the impact jarring her bruised ribs and sending a white-hot flash of agony through her chest. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale cigarettes and the cheap whiskey he must have started on at noon. "You look stressed. Real ragged. I don't think you're in any state to be behind the wheel." He reached for the keys clutched in her trembling hand, his fingers thick and calloused. Marlene felt the familiar surge of terror, the instinct to shrink, to become small and invisible. But then she thought of Mr. Abernathy's labored breathing, the way his hands shook when his sugar spiked. She wasn't just fighting for her keys, she was fighting for the lives he was holding hostage. The struggle was brief and visceral. Lloyd's weight pressed her into the car door, his hand crushing hers as he tried to pry the keys loose. "Give 'em to me," he hissed, his face inches from hers. Marlene didn't plead. She didn't cry out. Instead, she channeled every ounce of her fury into her right leg. She brought her knee up with a sharp, desperate force, catching him squarely in the shin. Lloyd let out a strangled yelp, his grip momentarily loosening as he stumbled back, clutching his leg. In that split second of distraction, Marlene snatched the keys back, her knuckles scraping against his flannel sleeve. She didn't wait to see if he'd lunged again. She ducked under his arm, scrambled into the driver's seat, and slammed the lock button just as his fist collided with the glass. The engine roared to life, a coughing, sputtering sound that felt like a triumph. She threw the car into reverse, the tires screeching against the cracked asphalt as she backed away from Lloyd, who was standing in the middle of the lot, shouting obscenities that were drowned out by the hum of her air conditioner. She didn't look back. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to grip the wheel until her knuckles turned white. She drove toward West Biloxi, her mind a blur of adrenaline and pain. She reached the clinic, a squat brick building that smelled of floor wax and old magazines, and burst through the doors. The nurse there, a woman named Elena, whom Marlene had known for years, handed over a small, insulated backup kit with a look of profound pity. "You okay, Marlene? You look like you've been through a thresher." Marlene just nodded, clutching the kit to her chest like a holy relic, and ran back to the car. The return trip to Magnolia Gardens was a blur of hazy sunlight and the constant, nagging fear that Lloyd would be waiting at the gate. But when she pulled back into the lot, he was nowhere to be seen. She entered through the loading dock, her heart still racing. As she passed the storage area, the very place she and Sarah had searched top to bottom only an hour ago, she stopped dead. There, sitting prominently on the middle shelf, was the blue and white cooler. It was sitting right where it should have been, mocking her with its sudden, convenient reappearance. Marlene felt a cold prickle of suspicion crawl up her spine. It was too perfect. She set the backup kit down and approached the cooler, her hand hesitating before she flipped the plastic latches. The lid creaked open, but the familiar cold mist of dry ice didn't greet her. Instead, Marlene stared down at a pile of heavy red bricks, wrapped in yellowed pages of the Biloxi Sun-Herald. There was no insulin, no vials of life-saving liquid, just the weight of the deception. She reached in, pulling out a handful of the crumpled newspaper, her mind reeling. The theft hadn't just been an act of greed. It was a calculated, malicious setup. Someone, Lloyd, and whoever was helping him, had gone to the trouble of replacing the contents to ensure that when she finally found the shipment, she would look like an incompetent fool who had lost her mind. They wanted her to fail, and they wanted it to happen in front of everyone. The realization of the setup was still sinking in when a sharp, rhythmic beeping began to echo from the west wing. The sound of a patient's emergency monitor. Marlene didn't have time to process her fury. She shoved the bricks aside and ran toward the sound, her limp forgotten. She burst into room 412 to find Mr. Abernathy slumped in his armchair, his skin the color of damp parchment and his breathing coming in ragged, wet gasps. Sarah was already there, hovering over him with a glucometer. "He's at 450, Marlene. He's crashing." Mr. Abernathy's eyes rolled back in his head, his gnarled fingers twitching against the faded blue of his cardigan. The urgency of the situation was a physical weight in the room. Without immediate intervention, his organs would begin to shut down within the hour. "I have the backup kit," Marlene said, her voice shaking as she reached for the small bag she'd left on the cart. But as her hand closed on empty air, her heart stopped. The cart was bare. The backup insulin she had just risked her life to get from the clinic was gone. She spun around, checking the bedside table, the floor, the bathroom. Nothing. Someone had followed her in, waited for the moment she was distracted by the bricks, and snatched the only thing that could save the old man. She stood in the center of the room, looking at Mr. Abernathy's gray, sweat-slicked face, feeling a level of helplessness that tasted like ash. The sabotage was complete. They had stripped her of every defense. The silence of the room was shattered by the sound of muffled shouting coming from the main corridor. Marlene left Sarah to stabilize Abernathy as best she could and ran toward the noise. She found a group of Jubilee volunteers huddled near the entrance of the main tent, their faces pale. "It's the auction items," one of them, a high school girl named Jessica, stammered. "The jewelry cases. The ones from the local boutiques. They're empty, Marlene. Someone took the necklaces and the watches while we were setting up the flower arrangements." Marlene leaned against the mint green wall, the cold realization washing over her. The insulin wasn't just a target, it was a distraction. While she had been frantically chasing vials across the county, Lloyd and his accomplice were picking the Jubilee clean. The chaos she was failing to contain was exactly what they needed to move through the building like ghosts. Driven by a sudden, sharp intuition, Marlene turned away from the tent and headed toward the service hallway that led to the basement storage. She noticed something she had missed in her earlier frantic sweeps. The red power lights on the security cameras were dark. She stepped closer, squinting in the harsh fluorescent glare. A neat, square piece of silver duct tape had been smoothed over each lens. She reached up and peeled one back, her fingers trembling. The tape hadn't been slapped on in a hurry. It was applied with a precision that required time and a ladder. As she looked at the sticky residue, she saw a faint, dark smudge, a thumbprint. But more importantly, she realized the tape had been applied from the inside. This wasn't a break-in. It was an inside job. The implications were a physical blow. Lloyd couldn't have done this alone. He didn't have the keys to the maintenance closet where the ladders were kept, and he certainly didn't know the camera blind spots as well as someone who worked here every day. He had a secret accomplice among the staff, someone who was helping him blind the house so he could gut it. Marlene felt a surge of nausea. Everyone she worked with, everyone she trusted, was now a suspect. She looked down the long, narrow hallway, the shadows seeming to stretch and darken. She was alone in a building full of people, hunted by the man she had once promised to love. A sudden, heavy thud vibrated through the floorboards beneath her feet, coming from the direction of the basement. It was the sound of something metallic hitting concrete. Marlene didn't call for Sarah. She didn't call the police. She knew that if she didn't catch them now, the evidence would vanish along with the auction money. She grabbed a heavy industrial flashlight from the nurse's station and slipped through the heavy steel door that led to the stairs. The basement was a labyrinth of cinder block and dripping pipes, smelling of damp earth and old linens. As she descended, the air grew colder, the silence broken only by the rhythmic drip-drip of a leaky valve. She rounded the corner of the boiler room and stopped. A shadowy figure was crouched over a crate in the far corner, the beam of a small pen light illuminating a pile of velvet-lined jewelry boxes. "Lloyd?" she whispered, her voice cracking. The figure spun around, and the light hit his face. It wasn't Lloyd. It was Gary, Lloyd's younger brother. A man Marlene hadn't seen in 3 years, a man who was supposed to be in a correctional facility 2 states away. Gary's round, boyish face was twisted into a snarl, his muddy eyes darting toward the exit. He was clutching a handful of gold watches, his knuckles white. The truth clicked into place. The Hatcher boys were back in business, and Magnolia Gardens was their personal vault. Gary didn't hesitate. He lunged at her with a desperate, animalistic speed. Marlene tried to raise the flashlight, but he was faster, his shoulders slamming into her chest and throwing her backward. She hit a row of heavy metal shelving with a bone-jarring impact. The rusted bolts groaned, and then, with a deafening screech of tearing metal, the entire rack collapsed. A massive steel beam, laden with boxes of heavy winter blankets, pinned her left leg firmly to the concrete floor. Marlene let out a choked scream, the pain in her leg competing with the agony in her ribs. She was trapped, the cold dampness of the basement floor seeping into her scrubs as Gary scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and malice. He stepped toward her, a heavy wrench in his hand, his shadow looming large against the cinder block wall. "You always had to be the hero, Marley." He spat, his voice a high-pitched tremor. "Lloyd said you'd be the problem." Marlene's fingers clawed at the floor, searching for anything to use as a weapon. Her hand brushed the cold, textured grip of the industrial flashlight that had fallen just out of reach. She lunged for it, her fingers closing around the metal just as Gary swung the wrench. She rolled her head to the side, the metal whistling past her ear, and swung the flashlight with every ounce of her remaining strength. The heavy end caught Gary squarely across the temple. He let out a soft grunt and crumpled to the floor, the jewelry spilling from his pockets like golden rain. Dazed and gasping, Marlene shoved against the steel beam. It didn't budge. She gritted her teeth, the salt of her own sweat stinging her eyes, and used the flashlight as a lever, wedging it under the rack and heaving upward. With a wet, sickening pop, her leg came free. She crawled away from Gary's unconscious form, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She needed a phone. She dragged herself toward a small, cluttered desk used by the maintenance crew. But as she reached for the landline, her hand knocked over a stack of manila folders. A small, leather-bound book slid out. Lloyd's personal ledger. She opened it, her eyes scanning the frantic, cramped handwriting. It wasn't just gambling debts. It was a roadmap of ruin. Lloyd had emptied their joint savings months ago, siphoning off every penny she had earned for their retirement. The ledger detailed a series of losses to local bookies that made her stomach turn. But the final entry, dated today, was the most chilling. Jubilee cash, 6:00 p.m., exit via North Gate, one way to Vegas. He wasn't just stealing the jewelry. He was planning to take the entire night's donations and vanish, leaving her to face the fallout of the missing meds and the robbed auction. He was going to burn her life to the ground and use the ashes to buy his way out of debt. Marlene clutched the ledger to her chest, the weight of the betrayal feeling heavier than the steel beam. She looked at Gary, still out cold on the floor, and then at the stairs. She couldn't just call the police. Lloyd would see them coming and vanish into the humid Mississippi night. She needed a witness. She needed someone the board couldn't ignore. She limped back up the stairs, every step a testament to her sheer force of will, and found Sarah in the hallway. She showed her the ledger, the blood on her scrubs, the cold fury in her eyes. "We're going to give the keynote speech, Sarah," Marlene whispered, her voice a sharp, clinical blade. "And we're going to invite Lloyd to the stage." The plan was a desperate gamble. But as the first heavy drops of a summer storm began to drum against the roof of the nursing home, Marlene felt a strange, terrifying sense of clarity. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending a chill through the mint-green hallways. Outside, the sky turned a bruised purple, the kind of light that preceded the violent deluges of the Gulf Coast. A massive power surge flickered the lights, the fluorescent tubes humming and popping before plunging the West Wing into a momentary, suffocating darkness. Then came the sound, a sickening, visceral crack, followed by a thundering crash that shook the very foundations of the building. A century-old oak tree had succumbed to the wind, its massive trunk shearing off and collapsing directly across the main access road. Magnolia Gardens was now a fortress, cut off from the hospital, the police, and the world. Marlene stood by the window, watching the rain turn the parking lot into a gray, churning sea. The isolation was absolute. She turned back to the medical cart, her hands trembling as she opened the backup insulin kit she had retrieved from the clinic. She needed to dose Mr. Abernathy now, or the ledger wouldn't matter. But as she pulled the first vial from its foam casing, she froze. The label was yellowed, the edges curling with age. She squinted at the expiration date. 04/2019. It was 5 years past its prime. She checked the second vial, then the third. All of them were ancient, useless, and potentially toxic. A wave of pure, unadulterated horror washed over her. The clinic hadn't helped her. They had cleared out their trash and handed it to a desperate woman. She was holding poison in her hands, and Mr. Abernathy was dying in the next room. She slumped against the wall, the expired vials clinking in her hand like funeral bells. But then, her eyes caught a flash of movement in the parking lot. Through the sheets of rain, she saw Lloyd's black sedan. It was parked crookedly near the delivery entrance, the trunk slightly ajar. A corner of a familiar blue and white tarp was flapping in the wind, and beneath it, she saw the unmistakable gleam of a plastic cooler. The original shipment. He hadn't sold it yet. He was keeping it in the car, a trophy of his control over her. He was sitting on the only thing that could save her residence, waiting for the Jubilee to hit its peak so he could make his move. Marlene didn't think. She didn't plan. She grabbed a heavy brass paperweight from the nurse's station and ran out into the storm. The rain hit her like a physical assault, soaking her scrubs in seconds and turning the world into a blur of gray and green. She reached the sedan, the wind howling in her ears, and swung the paperweight with a primal scream. The driver's side window shattered into 1,000 glittering diamonds. She reached in, ignoring the glass biting into her palms, and popped the trunk. There it was, the cooler, nestled among a pile of stolen linens and Gary's discarded flannel. She grabbed it, the weight of the real insulin feeling like a miracle, and turned to run back to the safety of the building. "Going somewhere, Marley?" The voice came from the shadows of the loading dock, low and heavy. Lloyd stepped into the rain, his face a mask of predatory intent. He didn't look like the man she had married. He looked like a beast, his eyes dark and hollow. He moved with a terrifying slow-motion grace, blocking her path to the steel door. The storm intensified, lightning illuminating the scene in jagged, strobing flashes. He didn't want the insulin. He wanted her to break. He wanted the keys to the facility safe, the one that would soon be filled with Jubilee donations. And he knew she was the only one who could give them to him. He lunged. Marlene tried to dodge, but the mud was a slick, treacherous trap. Her feet slipped, and she went down hard, the cooler skidding across the dirt. Lloyd was on her in an instant, his heavy boots pinning her legs as he shoved her face into the cold, wet earth. He grabbed her hair, yanking her head back until she was staring up into the dark, rain-streaked sky. "The keys, Marlene. Give me the goddamn keys or I'll leave you out here to drown." His hands moved to her throat, his thick fingers squeezing with a brutal, practiced pressure. The world began to dim at the edges, the sound of the rain fading into a high-pitched ringing. She clawed at his wrists, her lungs screaming for air. Her hand brushed the pocket of her scrubs, finding the hard, cold shape of the tactical pen she always carried for breaking glass or marking charts. She pulled it out, her vision tunneling, and drove the steel tip into the back of Lloyd's hand with every ounce of her fading strength. He let out a shriek of pure, unbridled agony and released his grip, clutching his bleeding hand to his chest. Marlene scrambled backward through the mud, her breath coming in ragged, burning gulps. She grabbed the cooler, her fingers slick with blood and mire, and hauled herself to her feet. She didn't look back as she sprinted toward the glowing lights of the Jubilee tent, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She burst through the canvas flaps, a vision of mud-stained, blood-streaked desperation. The tent was filled with the elite of Biloxi, men in tuxedos and women in silk gowns, all sipping champagne while the storm raged outside. Marlene scanned the crowd and saw the board president, a woman named Eleanor Whitmore who prided herself on order and decency. But before Marlene could reach her, Gary stepped out from behind a floral arrangement. He had a bandage on his head and a look of practiced, oily concern on his face. "There she is," he shouted, his voice cutting through the hum of conversation. "I told you, she's had a breakdown. She's dangerous." The crowd parted as if she were a leper. The board president stepped forward, her icy blue eyes narrowing with disgust. "Marlene, what is the meaning of this?" She looked at Marlene's muddied scrubs, the blood on her hands, the frantic look in her eyes. "Gary told us you've been struggling, that you've been taking medication from the stores for your own use. And now this? You're a disgrace to this facility." Marlene tried to speak, but her throat was raw, her voice a mere rasp against the judgmental murmur of the guests. She held out the cooler, but Eleanor stepped back, as if the life-saving medicine were filth. "I'm calling the police, Marlene. You're done here." Marlene stood frozen in the center of the garish, fairy-lit tent, the weight of the cooler pulling at her arms. She looked around at the faces of the people she had served for 20 years, and all she saw was a wall of judgment. Then the flap opened again, and Lloyd walked in. He was soaking wet, his hand wrapped in a bloody rag, but his face was a masterpiece of false sympathy. He walked straight to Marlene and wrapped a heavy, possessive arm around her shoulders. He leaned in, his thumb digging into her bruised ribs with a force that made her gasp. But to the crowd, it looked like a husband comforting a broken wife. "It's okay, Marley," he whispered, his voice a low, terrifying hum. "I've got you. Let's just go home." He turned to the crowd, his voice rising in a paternalistic tone that made Marlene's skin crawl. "I'm so sorry, everyone. My wife has been under a lot of pressure. A medical episode, the stress of the Jubilee. I'll take her home now. Please continue with the evening. Don't let this ruin the celebration." He began to steer her toward the exit, his grip on her ribs tightening until she felt something pop. He was winning. He was going to walk her out of this tent, take the keys, and she would never be seen again. But Marlene Hatcher was a nurse. She was trained to stay calm when the world was ending. She closed her eyes, focused on the rhythmic thump-thump of her own heart, and utilized every ounce of her crisis de-escalation training. She didn't struggle. She didn't scream. She went perfectly still, her body becoming a dead weight in Lloyd's arms. The sudden change in her energy made him hesitate, his grip loosening just a fraction. In that moment of stillness, Marlene leaned directly into the podium microphone, her voice coming out not as a scream, but as a cold, clinical recitation of facts. "The insulin shipment number is 8842 Alpha," she said, her voice echoing through the silent tent with the precision of a scalpel. "It is currently sitting in the trunk of a black sedan, license plate Mississippi KLR 302, along with 3 gold Rolexes and a diamond tennis necklace from the silent auction." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the storm seemed to hold its breath. Marlene didn't stop. She looked directly at Eleanor Whitmore and began to unbutton the top of her muddied scrubs. She pulled the fabric aside, revealing the massive, sickening purple bruise on her ribs, and then the older, faded scars on her shoulders. "These are the hidden storms of Magnolia Gardens," she said, her voice never wavering. "My husband didn't bring me here to save me. He brought me here to silence me, because I found out he was gutting this place to pay for his poker games." The shift in the room was palpable, a physical change in the air. Sarah Thompson stepped forward, her face set in a mask of fury. "I saw the car, Eleanor. I saw him at the dock." The board president looked from Marlene's bruised skin to Lloyd's panicked, sweating face. She didn't say a word. She simply turned and walked toward the exit, followed by 2 of the security guards. The crowd remained frozen, a sea of silk and wool watching as the facade of the charitable husband crumbled into the mud. Minutes later, Eleanor returned, her face pale. She was holding a handful of jewelry and a ledger. She looked at Lloyd, her expression one of pure, unadulterated loathing. "He's right, Marlene. It's all there." She turned to the guards. "Hold them. Don't let them leave." Lloyd's eyes darted around the room, the predatory mask returning. He realized he was trapped. With a roar of desperation, he lunged for Marlene, his hands reaching for her throat one last time. He was going to take her with him, a final act of spiteful possession. But he never reached her. A wall of yellow t-shirts moved as one. The local women, the nurses, the volunteers, the daughters of the residents, stepped in front of Marlene. They didn't use weapons. They used their bodies, a solid, unyielding human barrier that Lloyd couldn't break. Dottie from the diner, Sarah, even young Jessica. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces set in the same grim determination Marlene had carried for 20 years. Lloyd recoiled, his power dissolving in the face of their collective defiance. He backed away, stumbling over a folding chair, right into the arms of the deputies who had managed to clear the fallen tree and reach the facility. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Marlene didn't watch them lead him away. She didn't care about the arrest or the jewelry. She turned to Sarah and handed over the cooler. "Mr. Abernathy," was all she said. Sarah nodded, her eyes bright with tears, and sprinted toward the medical wing. The storm began to break, the violent rain fading into a soft, rhythmic patter. The jubilee was over. The donors were leaving, and the garish streamers were sagging in the humidity. Marlene walked out of the tent, her steps slow and heavy, and sat on the old wooden porch of the East Wing. The air was finally clear, the suffocating pressure of the Mississippi heat washed away by the deluge. She looked out at the horizon, where the first faint light of dawn was beginning to bleed into the sky. She felt the scar above her eyebrow, the bruise on her ribs, the ache in her leg. They were still there, but they didn't feel like chains anymore. They felt like a map of a war she had finally finished fighting. She watched the sunrise, a pale, hopeful gold spreading over the Gulf. And for the first time in 20 years, Marlene Hatcher took a breath that didn't hurt. She wasn't a victim, a wife, or a secret. She was the protector of this house, and she was finally, beautifully, alone.